the wildlife generally choose not to do that unless they really, really have to. So it might be possible, I mean, our dung counts don't support it, but it might have been possible that the wildlife was coming in at night and doing some grazing, but they might have been doing peripheral grazing. Sort of the Conservancy is sort of to the east side of this system, so they might have peripherally been grazing on the east side. It's really, I mean, it's hard to say without any evidence, you know, from the dung counts. We had a couple of baboons and a couple of impala that were all up in that far northeastern transects. So you probably want to, you know, extend those transects a little farther in order to capture that, and definitely during, you know, years with a stronger dry season or higher, you know, drought years, I think you would see more of that. There's also a lot of elephant activity in that area. So we weren't able to spend much time in the evening out there. It's just not safe. So we weren't able to like really observe if any wildlife was coming in at night. So, but it, yeah, I mean, it could be in terms of the preferential grazing. You can see a very different dynamic if you include wildlife as well. We don't have any evidence of that. So.
I noticed that you highlighted the north-south directionality, but from your figures, I kind of noticed an east-west directionality as well, and I was wondering if you investigated that.
Yeah, so in terms of the east-west, we used, sort of ties in with the flooding frequency because our transects ran east-west, and we were using distance from the river, which runs generally north-south. Though the river, as you could see from that, was a little bit further to the right. I'm just gonna, so we never investigated sort of, we took a center line in the transects and moved east to west. But from the data that we've seen in terms of the flooding frequency being so poorly correlated, it was like, I think the R value for that was like 0.1. So 1 being perfectly correlated, 0 being not correlated at all. So it's really, really poorly correlated. I would be hesitant to further go in that direction. I don't think it would tell us much more. And I think the strength of the north-south variability highlights more of the variation than necessarily east-west might. But I mean, it's something that you could definitely go back to the data and ask. But the flooding frequency attempts to get some of that east-west variation, or account for some of that east-west variation. But it's true that there was a couple plots way out to the east that were generally on that north section, but statistically they didn't seem to be strong enough to suggest any strong correlation.
So every dry season, when the floodplains kind of recede into the river, does the plant community structure essentially get wiped out? Like, or everything kind of dries up and dies, right?
Well, that's what evidence has shown. I think for the simplification of this investigation, we have assumed to a certain degree that is happening equally across the floodplain. I think you could look at temporal studies to really get a true idea of how that's happening, but there may be some influence on the fact that you have a permanent swamp area to the south and you don't have that to the north. You have a permanent riverine system. So you actually may see a gradient of how that's happening as you move from north to south. Right. So you might see less inundation the further south you go and more of that inundation as you go further north. But I think
and I was just also wondering, you know, what that means for when the the flood season comes again and the new community structure kind of establishes. Is it kind of repeatable?
Is it predictable every year? Exactly. And that requires a temporal study for sure. But
or observations from the people who've been around. I don't know if they
I mean, it's hard to say. You would assume, I think one of the things that we've tried to look at in terms of how we are seeing certain species really far to the north and some really far to the south, and we've basically said that the most likely scenario for that is this dispersal mechanism. Right. So obviously there is some play there in terms of how that establishment happens, but I'd be hesitant to say much more from this data. But it's really interesting point.
It seems like there's a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think the key part of this is not one factor is playing in isolation. Like, yes, we were able to prove that grazing is having this really high intensity in a certain area and flooding is not, but all of these factors do have some sort of play, and they are, playing in correlation with each other. So we were attempting to tease them apart and ask specific questions about each variable, but we can't forget that the larger system is actually an interaction between all of those. So.
Does fire play any part in the ecosystem?
Not in this one, which is interesting. Fire plays a big part in the model. There's lots of stuff that goes on in there. But no, not in any of the studies that I've looked at in the area, and not in any recollection of any NASA that I talked with or anything. Fire disturbance doesn't seem to play a role.
Is that because there's insufficient dry biomass?
Probably. Or you don't need that disturbance. A lot of plant species require that fire disturbance in order to.
Oh, right, no.
Yeah, and I don't think.
Fire's going to start, there must be lightning storms, there must be.
I'm sure, but I'm sure there's not enough biomass for those to actually.
Sustain.
Yeah. I mean, literally, during the dry season, the savanna areas are like just dust. Just dust everywhere. You get a few bushes, but.
You can get more fire in Savannah.
You could, but it all gets grazed down before the end of the dry season. Like there's nothing. It's so dry. I mean, you breathe in dust. It's so dusty. So.
Is there a specific time frame for like the recovery of the area after a dry season?
Well, I mean, I attempted to observe that, and not without, and we weren't able to get in there. But I went down. So we sampled at the end of March. Rain started on the 24th of March. I remember the exact day because I wanted to do one more transect and I couldn't. Anyways, and I went down there a week later and I stood in grass up to here.
Wow.
Like it was overtopping me. So, I mean, these are highly, highly productive areas. And we purposely sampled at the end of the dry season to try and capture, what's happening at that specific time.
Mm-hmm.
There would be a whole different set of questions to try and look at what's happening through those cycles, which would be really interesting.
So I'll ask you a question. I have a couple that I thought of. Well, I didn't have any sort of in mind before, but a couple that I thought of while you were working. So one, I was going to ask, because you're talking about the sheep and or goats apparently being influential.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the case, do you think, that they are simply inherently more destructive on the plants? That is to say, they have more of a capacity for destroying plants, say, than given biomass that cattle would? Or is it that maybe the Maasai care more about cattle than they do about sheep and goats, and so they don't control the sheep and goats the same way? Or neither of the above.
Well, I don't think that control of the animals plays any play whatsoever. This system is very contained, and the Maasai literally just set them free, and there's no herding going on whatsoever within the floodplain.
Oh, right, but I was thinking in terms of, they do make strategic decisions about.
Well, they make strategic decisions to send them to the floodplain,
yeah.
But within the system that we sampled, there's no herding going on.
So
the cattle and sheep have, very much a choice in where they spend their time. I actually found this to be very surprising because I felt, when I was out there that I was seeing an even distribution, but I mean, obviously I wasn't. There is some concern that, saying much in terms of the comparing how cattle are influencing is a tricky area, which is why I tried to concentrate more just on how sheep are comparing within the system and not comparing cows to sheep, because I think behaviorally they forage very differently. However, I think probably the biggest take-home part of that is that, sheep and goat numbers are increasing ever more in pastoralist communities in East Africa because you can recuperate those stocks much faster than you can your cattle. So, since this 2009 drought, some cattle herds are still only at 15, 20 individuals, where people have been able to build up their sheep and goats to now 200-300 individuals again. So you're seeing a higher concentration of the sheep there anyways, but I think what's more interesting is that they are specializing on a specific area and a specific vegetation composition, which
so the prospects
you don't.
For those sites are probably worse.
Exactly, and because there probably is a higher pressure. And which is interesting because you don't think of sheep and goats as being specialist at all. You think of them eating absolutely anything wherever they want, you know? So, like, I've even seen them, there's these little yellow berries that grow on this one plant that are super poisonous. And I've seen goats tear the leaves off of around these little berries because they'll eat anything.
So
Anyways.
they're reasonably selective.
Yeah.
So is it the case then that those areas, you have to make recommendations in those areas for either moving the animals away, which may be difficult because of the herding lack, or you can't suggest people to get rid of their animals?
No, definitely not. But there may be, I mean, it may just be significant enough to say that cattle aren't having such detriment sort of impact on the system where sheep and goats are. And just being able to express that knowledge to the community for their own decision is probably as much as you could do. I definitely don't think that you can make a recommendation for change. But, you know, as a culture that I think is developing quite rapidly, and, you know, as any culture in the world, you know, being influenced by, you know, globalization and all these kind of things, they feel a much stronger cultural tie to their cattle and always will, and that's something they'll never give up. But sheep and goats are just more your bread and butter. It's how you pay your kids' school fees. You know, it's how you have lunch on Sunday. So, you know, changing those numbers and influencing the way people feel about their sheep and goats might be a little bit easier than their cattle. You could never change the way Maasai feels about his cows.
I was wondering if there's anything with setting apart, like vegetation-wise, the areas that were being more heavily grazed, like if there was a specific type that was being grazed more heavily, or